Hello there. I'd like to talk to you about the only fast patrol boat squadron ever put in the field by the UN, and it happened in Central America. It was in support of the peace process overall between the 5 countries, but more importantly in the peace process in El Salvador. The United Nations has frequently put unarmed military observers into the field to check that a ceasefire or a peace process is being implemented by the parties. In this case, as the end of the peace process was coming along in El Salvador, it was suggested that it would build confidence if there was a maritime check on the huge Gulf of Fonseca that separates El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. They all have a border on that Gulf. That there were no weapons or ammunition being smuggled from any one of the countries into El Salvador, where the insurgents were still at war, although fully engaged in the peace process. The Argentinian Navy volunteered 4 of their fast patrol boats, and they came with crews, with maintenance people, with captains, and with a squadron, and they were essentially a fleet of waterborne taxis. The United Nations then provided unarmed military observers who would go on board the fast patrol boats and do the checking at sea of whatever it was they were supposed to check. No real effort was put in by many people at which actual job the fast patrol boats would do. But they arrived and they started doing their job, and we as unarmed military observers were running the operations and going on board to conduct the patrols. We didn't drive the boats. The Argentine captains drove their own boats with their own officers and their own men. But we told the captain where we wanted to be taken and at what time we wanted to get there. So, this is what the fast patrol boats, or gauchos as we called them, look like. This picture here shows the 4 gauchos alongside. You see the UN written on the back, and you see that these are 30 tons approximately, have a crew of about 6 or 8. And they were great fun to whiz around on. This is a very poor photograph of the gauchos at sea. It's just basically a white blob making a lot of white wake. Because there was no history of what to do, it was assumed that it would be sorted out by the squadron. Because the army said that military observers on ships had to be naval officers, not army officers, a number of navies, including the Canadian Navy, said that they would send officers. So we had officers who had no history or tradition of being military observers on board boats that were completely unused to working in that kind of tropical environment, in a context where nobody really knew how to employ the fast patrol boats. So we had to make it up as we went along. And I say it was a lot of fun. To start with, we did arbitrary patrolling in random areas. We then realized there were certain points that were much more likely to be being used by smugglers if smuggling was going on. So we started to do focus patrols on what we call choke points, or areas where traffic moving between the countries would have to be. And then we discovered that the airplanes that the mission had available to it had some spare airtime, and the air crews were very keen to come down and use the great big disused airfield close to the patrol boat base as a practice runway for coming in and going out. And so we started to try and do some air-sea cooperation, where the airplanes would provide area surveillance, and the little boats, the gauchos, would then go to where the airplane said there was activity, suspicious or otherwise. This was dogged by all extempore and improvised organizations, problems. Sometimes the patrol boats would break down. Sometimes at the last minute, the airplanes would be called off for what they called their proper tasking. And so even by the end of the time of the squadron, we were lucky if we had 1 day in 15 or 1 day in 18 when we had an airplane spotting and the gauchos ready to go and see what they were doing. So let's have a look at the utility and disutility of the patrol boat squadron. We have here a Canevin analysis of what we were doing. In the obvious domain, because there were huge patrol areas and only 4 patrol boats, 3 of which were available at any one time, it was very, very often completely arbitrary where they went. And what was missing was any kind of tactical intelligence until we got the airplanes to come in. And as I say, we, the squadron, started working on that to get them. And by the end of our time, they were doing it some of the time. So in the complicated domain, what were the good practices that we practiced? Well, we knew that visible patrolling off the populated areas where the big villages were would produce buzz amongst the local people. All the fishermen knew each other, irrespective of which country they came from. And sometimes they got on with each other, like fishermen everywhere, and sometimes they didn't. But what they did do, whether they were getting on or not, was they gossiped. So when they knew that the patrol boats were out, they would be telling each other, and whoever was talking to them would be getting the idea that the patrol boats were out. One of the issues of the choke points was that by day it was very easy to see what was going on. So we started to increase night patrols in the choke points or areas of concern. This was a lot of fun, and we're not sure what they did, but it was good doing it. Finally, probably the best practice that we developed was buying fresh fish, particularly the large, beautiful prawns, from the fishermen whilst they were out in their little boat, sometimes even in a dugout canoe, and they were just paddling. And we would stop them and we'd ask if they had any fish, and they would say yes, and we'd ask how much they want. And instead of beating them down, we would give them a fair or very good price for their fish. Firstly, the fish was completely fresh, and secondly, it made the fishermen really happy and chatty. And if there's one guy who knows what's going on in his neighborhood, his part of the Gulf, it was the local fisherman. And so we started to develop our own completely organic tactical intelligence with respect to who was doing what, where, why, and when. We weren't interested in regular smuggling, and there was certainly evidence of that going on. We were interested only in the passage of weapons or ammunition to any of the combatant parties in the war in El Salvador. And finally, the complex domain. The evolution of the complicated air-sea liaison was a classic thing that had to be tried. Failures had to be noted and got round. Communications between an airplane with radio normally for other airplane and airport use was not useful for tactical communications with the boats. So we then used to put one of our people in the plane with our own radio communications, and then he would talk to the boat down below, and then he would talk to the pilot, and he would become the tactical liaison up in the sky. Eventually, it started to sort of work. Finally, in the chaotic, the operational effectiveness was always being compromised by breakdown and institutional unfamiliarity with running a squadron. And every time we had a major roadblock, we just had to regroup, restart, and go again. So what really was the utility and the futility of this little patrol boat squadron? There is no doubt that it was a good confidence-building measure amongst the parties, because they could point to not only land observers observing the ceasefire, but maritime and air observers observing the ceasefire. On the ground, tactically, you could say there was no proof that a single bullet or a single gun was deterred from traveling across the Gulf of Fonseca. However, as I say, at the strategic level, it was a confidence-building measure. It was asked for by the parties, and it was implemented as well as it could be by the guys on the ground and the sailors in the gauchos. And that's the story of the only fast patrol boat squadron the United Nations has ever had.